Good morning. I want to begin today by addressing something that has moved beyond the realm of political rhetoric and entered the domain of measurable economic consequence. The claim that the United States does not need Canadian lumber, a claim that was made with considerable confidence and, I would argue, without sufficient grounding in the structural realities of our housing supply chain, has now produced outcomes that were, frankly, foreseeable. The data we are reviewing as of the first half of 2026 tells a story that is neither partisan nor ambiguous. It is a story written in construction delays, in rising material costs, in stalled housing developments, and in the quiet but deeply consequential decisions made by Canadian lumber exporters to redirect their supply toward markets that were willing to engage without the burden of escalating tariffs and political uncertainty. I say this not to assign blame in a political sense, but because sound economic policy requires that we look directly at consequences, not away from them. Let me provide some context that I believe is essential to understanding how we arrived at this moment. The United States and Canada share what has historically been one of the most integrated bilateral trade relationships in the world. Across sectors ranging from energy to agriculture to advanced manufacturing, the two economies have operated with a degree of interdependence that was not accidental. It was the product of decades of deliberate policy architecture, agreements negotiated carefully, supply chains built with cross border efficiency in mind, and pricing structures that reflected the geographic and logistical advantages of proximity. Lumber, and softwood lumber in particular, sits at the very heart of this relationship. For generations, Canadian softwood lumber has supplied a substantial and structurally irreplaceable share of the inputs required by the American homebuilding industry. At peak demand periods, Canadian lumber has accounted for anywhere between 25 and 32% of total softwood lumber consumed in the United States. That is not a marginal figure. That is a load bearing number in the most literal sense of the term. When the assertion was made that the United States does not need Canadian lumber, I believe the underlying assumption, whether stated or unstated, was that domestic production could absorb the gap or that alternative international suppliers could fill it within a reasonable time frame. I want to examine both of those assumptions carefully because both of them have now been tested by reality, and the results are instructive. On the question of domestic production capacity, it is important to understand that lumber milling and timber harvesting in the United States is not an industry that can scale rapidly in response to a short-term policy signal. The infrastructure required to expand domestic production, the mills, the harvesting equipment, the trained labor force, the environmental permitting processes, the replanting and forest management timelines, operates on a horizon of years and in some cases decades, not months. When Canadian lumber began flowing into alternative markets in response to the tariff environment and the political signals emanating from Washington, American homebuilders did not find a domestic industry standing ready to absorb that volume. They found instead a domestic industry that was already operating near capacity and that lacked the structural flexibility to expand meaningfully within the window that market conditions demanded. The second assumption, that alternative international suppliers could compensate, deserves equal scrutiny. The global softwood lumber market is not structured in a way that allows for rapid reorientation of supply. European producers, primarily in Scandinavia and Central Europe, have their own domestic demands and their own established export relationships. They were not positioned to redirect substantial volumes to the United States on short notice, and even where additional supply was theoretically available, the logistics of transatlantic lumber shipping introduced cost premiums that made the economics deeply unfavorable. American homebuilders who attempted to source from European suppliers found themselves facing longer lead times, higher freight costs, and currency dynamics that further eroded their project margins. The arithmetic of project financing, which is already operating under considerable stress in a higher interest rate environment, does not accommodate those kinds of cost escalations without consequence, and the consequences have been substantial. By the middle of 2026, we are looking at approximately $3.2 billion in housing project value that has been delayed, restructured, or in some cases abandoned entirely due to the combined pressure of material cost inflation and supply uncertainty in the lumber market. I want to be precise about what that number represents because it is easy for large figures to become abstract. That $3.2 billion does not represent a loss on a balance sheet somewhere in the abstract financial system. It represents apartment complexes that were scheduled to break ground and did not. It represents affordable housing developments in cities where the inventory crisis was already acute before this disruption. It represents single family home projects in suburban and exurban markets where demand from first time buyers has been building for years and where the supply response has now been set back by an additional and entirely policy driven constraint. It represents construction workers who were expecting contracts that did not materialize, and small and mid sized home building firms whose project pipelines have been disrupted in ways that will take time to recover from. I have spent a great deal of my professional life thinking about the relationship between policy decisions and economic outcomes. And one of the lessons that experience consistently reinforces is that supply chain disruptions rarely announce themselves dramatically. They unfold gradually through a series of adjustments and substitutions and delays that individually seem manageable, but that accumulate into structural problems that are far more difficult to address than the original policy choice that initiated them. What we are observing in the lumber market and in the housing sector is precisely that kind of gradual compounding disruption. The decision to treat Canadian lumber as a political variable rather than an economic input has introduced friction into a supply chain that was functioning with reasonable efficiency, and that friction has now produced heat in the form of cost increases, project delays, and a housing affordability situation that was already one of the most serious domestic economic challenges facing American families. I will note, because I think it is important context for everything that follows, that the Canadian response to this situation has been measured but consequential. Canada did not engage in retaliatory escalation in the theatrical sense. What Canada did, and what any rational economic actor would do when faced with an unstable and punitive trade relationship, was diversify. Canadian lumber producers, working in close coordination with provincial governments and with the active encouragement of federal trade policy, began systematically developing and deepening relationships with buyers in Europe and in the Asia-Pacific region. Japan, South Korea, and several European Union member states have all increased their imports of Canadian softwood lumber over the past 18 months. China, which had previously been a significant but secondary market for Canadian lumber exports, has accelerated its purchasing in ways that reflect both genuine demand and a strategic interest in securing supply relationships that are not subject to the kind of political volatility that has characterized the North American trade environment. The result is that the Canadian lumber industry, rather than being weakened by the disruption of its American relationship, has in many respects strengthened its global market position. It has reduced its dependence on a single buyer, the United States, and it has established footholds in growth markets that will continue to expand as urbanization and construction activity in Asia and elsewhere proceed through the coming decades. This is not a development that should surprise any student of trade economics. When a reliable buyer introduces significant and unpredictable costs into a commercial relationship, sellers adapt. They find other buyers. They invest in the logistics and relationships required to serve those buyers. And over time, the original buyer finds that the leverage they believed they possessed was, in fact, considerably more fragile than they had assumed. The United States has historically been in the fortunate position of being a large, wealthy, and reliable market, a buyer whose scale and purchasing power gave it significant influence in its commercial relationships. That position of influence is not unlimited, and it is not unconditional. It depends in part on the United States behaving as a predictable and rule-governed participant in international commerce. When that predictability is called into question, partners begin to hedge, and hedges have a way of becoming permanent realignments. As I turn to the specific mechanisms through which the lumber disruption has propagated through the housing market, the pricing dynamics, the financing challenges, the regional variations in impact, and the feedback loops between housing supply constraints and broader inflationary pressures. I want to emphasize that the analysis I am presenting is grounded in the best available data from the Census Bureau, the National Association of Home Builders, the Federal Reserve's regional surveys, and our own Treasury Department assessments. The picture that data paints is one that demands serious policy attention, and it is a picture that I intend to describe with the clarity and specificity that the moment requires. The American people deserve an honest accounting of how we arrived here, and they deserve a clear-eyed assessment of what it will take to move forward constructively. To understand the full dimension of what a $3.2 billion collapse in housing project value means for the American economy, we must begin by situating that figure within the broader context of the housing market as it existed before this disruption took hold. The United States entered 2025 with a housing deficit that, by most credible estimates, ranged between 3.5 million and 4.5 million units. That deficit was not created overnight. It was the accumulated result of more than a decade of underbuilding that followed the 2008 financial crisis, during which the home building industry contracted sharply and never fully recovered its pre-crisis production capacity. The labor force shrank, smaller builders exited the market, and the institutional memory and physical infrastructure required to produce housing at scale eroded in ways that proved far more durable than most forecasters anticipated. When demand recovered, driven by demographic trends, by the work-from-home migration patterns accelerated by the pandemic, and by the pent-up household formation of millennials finally reaching peak home buying age, the supply side was simply not equipped to respond with the speed or volume that the market required. Into that already strained environment, the disruption of Canadian lumber supply has introduced a cost and availability shock that has affected the home building sector at precisely the moment when it could least absorb it. To be specific about the pricing dynamics, softwood lumber prices, which had shown some stabilization through the latter part of 2024 after the extraordinary volatility of the pandemic years, began climbing again in the first quarter of 2025 as the tariff environment hardened and as Canadian producers began signaling their intentions to redirect supply. By the end of 2025, lumber prices had increased by between 22 and 31%, depending on the grade and species, with the sharpest increases concentrated in the dimensional lumber products, 2x4s, 2x6s, and engineered lumber components that form the structural backbone of residential construction. For a typical single-family home, the lumber component of construction cost represents somewhere between 15 and 20% of total material expenses. A 25% increase in lumber prices therefore translates to a 3.75 to 5% increase in total material costs for a home, before accounting for any secondary effects on labor scheduling, project timelines, or financing carrying costs. Those secondary effects, however, are where the real damage accumulates, and they are less visible in the headline price data, but no less consequential. When material costs rise unexpectedly mid-project, builders face a set of choices that are all economically painful. They can absorb the cost increase and accept reduced margins, which, for smaller builders operating on thin project-level financing, can mean the difference between a viable project and an unviable one. They can attempt to pass the cost increase through to buyers, which, in a market where mortgage rates remain elevated and where affordability is already at multi-decade lows, means risking the loss of buyers who simply cannot qualify for or afford the higher purchase price. Or they can pause the project, waiting for either costs to moderate or market conditions to improve, which introduces carrying costs on the land and the construction financing that themselves accumulate over time and further erode project economics. The data we are observing suggests that all three of these responses have been occurring simultaneously across different segments of the market, and that the cumulative effect of these decisions is the $3.2 billion in project value disruption that I referenced at the outset. The geographic distribution of this disruption is not uniform, and understanding its regional pattern helps clarify both the severity of the impact and the policy responses that are most urgently needed. The markets that have been most severely affected are, not surprisingly, those where construction activity was most intensive and where the pipeline of planned projects was most dependent on cost assumptions that have since been invalidated by the lumber price environment. The Sunbelt markets, Texas, Florida, Arizona, Georgia, and the Carolinas, which had been leading the national recovery in housing starts, have seen the most significant concentration of project delays and cancellations. These are markets where population growth has been strong, where land is relatively available, and where the home building industry had been responding to demand with genuine energy and ambition. The disruption of that momentum is particularly painful because these are precisely the markets where new supply was making the most meaningful contribution to addressing the national housing deficit. In the Northeast and on the West Coast, the dynamics are somewhat different but no less serious. In these markets where land costs are high, regulatory environments are complex, and project timelines are already extended, the addition of material cost uncertainty has tipped a number of projects that were already marginal from a financial standpoint into the category of projects that cannot be made to pencil. Affordable housing developments, which depend on a careful assembly of public subsidies, tax credits, and private financing that must all be coordinated simultaneously, have been particularly vulnerable to this kind of cost shock. When the lumber cost assumption underlying a low-income housing tax credit project changes by 20 or 25% between the time the project is underwritten and the time construction is scheduled to begin, the entire financial structure of the project can unravel. Gap financing must be found, timelines must be extended, and in some cases, the project must be returned to the drawing board entirely. The communities that were counting on that affordable housing, the working families, the seniors on fixed incomes, the essential workers who commute long distances because they cannot afford to live near their jobs, bear the ultimate cost of these disruptions in the most direct and personal way. I want to spend some time on the financing dimension of this problem because I think it receives insufficient attention in most discussions of housing supply. The cost of constructing a home is not simply the sum of its material and labor inputs. It also includes the cost of the capital that finances construction from groundbreaking to sale, and that financing cost is sensitive to both the level of interest rates and the duration of the construction period. In an environment where benchmark interest rates remain elevated relative to the pre-pandemic era, construction financing is significantly more expensive than it was during the period when much of the current project pipeline was originally conceived and underwritten. When material cost increases cause construction timelines to extend because builders are waiting for prices to moderate, or because supply chain disruptions are causing scheduling problems that delay the sequencing of trades, the carrying cost of that financing increases in direct proportion to the extension of the timeline. A project that was originally projected to take 12 months to complete and that now takes 16 months has incurred 4 additional months of construction loan interest, which at current rates represents a meaningful addition to total project cost. Multiply that dynamic across thousands of projects simultaneously, and you begin to understand why the aggregate impact reaches the magnitude that it has. The Federal Reserve, in its most recent Beige Book survey of regional economic conditions, noted that home builders across multiple districts were reporting that material cost uncertainty was among their top concerns, ranking alongside labor availability and permitting delays as the primary constraints on their ability to respond to housing demand. That is a significant finding because it suggests that the lumber disruption is not being experienced as an isolated or temporary inconvenience by the industry, but rather as a structural constraint that is shaping business decisions in fundamental ways. Builders are adjusting their project selection criteria to favor developments that are less lumber intensive. They are investing in alternative construction technologies, including modular construction, mass timber, and concrete framing, at an accelerated pace. They are revising their land acquisition strategies to account for higher material cost contingencies. These adaptations are rational, and some of them may produce long-term benefits in terms of construction innovation and supply chain diversification. But they take time to implement, and in the interim, they represent a diversion of management attention and capital away from the core task of producing housing at scale. There is another dimension of this disruption that I want to address directly because I think it connects the lumber market situation to broader questions about the relationship between trade policy and domestic economic welfare that are central to any serious policy analysis. The argument that was made in support of the confrontational posture toward Canadian lumber imports was, at its core, an argument about protecting American jobs in the domestic timber and milling industry. That is a legitimate policy objective, and I want to engage with it seriously rather than dismissing it. The American timber industry does employ real workers in real communities, many of which have experienced significant economic stress over the past several decades as global competition and technological change have restructured the industry. The desire to protect and strengthen those communities is understandable, and policies designed to support domestic timber production and processing can, when well designed, contribute meaningfully to regional economic development. The difficulty is that the policy instrument chosen, broad tariffs on Canadian lumber combined with political signaling that called into question the fundamental reliability of the bilateral trade relationship, was not well calibrated to achieve that objective. The domestic timber industry did not have the capacity to absorb the market share that Canadian producers were vacating, and the timeline required to build that capacity is measured in years, not months. In the interim, the costs of the disruption have been borne primarily not by Canadian lumber producers who have successfully redirected their supply, but by American home builders, American homebuyers, and the American workers employed in the construction industry. A more carefully designed industrial policy, one that combined targeted investment in domestic milling capacity, workforce development programs, and a stable trade framework that provided predictability for cross-border supply chains while creating incentives for domestic expansion, could have pursued the same underlying objective at a fraction of the economic cost. That is a lesson worth internalizing as we consider how to move forward. The interaction between lumber costs and the broader housing affordability crisis deserves careful attention as well, because it connects this specific supply chain disruption to one of the most significant long-term economic challenges facing American households. Housing affordability, measured by the share of income that households must devote to housing costs, has deteriorated significantly over the past decade, and that deterioration has had profound consequences for economic mobility, for household financial resilience, and for the geographic distribution of economic opportunity across the country. When housing costs consume an excessive share of household income, families have less to invest in education, in healthcare, in retirement savings, and in the consumption of goods and services that drives broader economic growth. The connection between housing supply, housing costs, and household economic welfare is direct and well documented. And any policy that restricts housing supply or raises construction costs without producing compensating benefits is, in effect, a policy that makes it harder for American families to build economic security.